Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this, because today we are untangling one of the most fascinating and honestly misunderstood eras in all of human history. I mean, when you hear the word Viking, your mind probably jumps straight to horned helmets, burning villages, and terrifying warriors swinging axes, right? But how much of that is the absolute truth, and how much is just a myth that's been passed down through the generations? Well, today we're going to act as historical detectives. We are going to use the hard evidence to uncover why the Norse expansion actually happened, unravel their incredibly complex motivations, and finally get to the truth about Viking brutality.
Seriously, take a second and think about that. Who would you rather be judged by? Your best friend or someone you literally just robbed? The answer's pretty obvious, isn't it? And yet, here is the wild thing. For over 1,200 years, almost everything historians knew about the Vikings was written by the exact people the Vikings had just robbed. Understanding why they raided and whether they were truly just mindless savages absolutely has to start with acknowledging this massive source bias. We've basically been reading history written solely by traumatized victims.
Now, there is just a fascinating contrast between our historical perspectives here. On one hand, we have the vast majority of our written sources coming from Christian monks and clergy. Think about it. They had just watched their monasteries get sacked. They were writing for a Christian audience, so they used language designed to horrify, calling the raiders pagan wolves, godless men, and agents of Satan. They really emphasized the sacrilege. Now, this doesn't mean they were lying. I mean, the raids were genuinely terrifying, but it's only one side of the story. Because on the other hand, we have the Norse sagas. These were written down a couple of centuries later, and they present a completely different world, one focused on intense personal honor, highly complex legal systems, and vast exploration. So the crucial takeaway here is that we have to recognize the truth lives somewhere in the middle of those two extremes.
Section 1. The 5 motivations. Why they actually raided.
A whole society doesn't just wake up one morning and decide to launch centuries of warfare. Historians have actually identified 5 distinct motivations for raiding, and the fascinating part is they were all operating simultaneously. First up, wealth. Monasteries were practically medieval banks. They held centuries of accumulated gold and silver. A single successful raid could bring in more wealth than a lifetime of farming. Second, slaves, which we'll touch on more in a second. Third, land. The long-term goal for a lot of Norsemen wasn't just to steal and leave, it was settlement, creating massive established territories like the Danelaw in Britain. Fourth, reputation. Norse culture placed a huge emphasis on honor and fame, so leading a successful raid built incredible social status. And fifth, trade. This one is so often overlooked. The Norse expansion was fundamentally commercial. In fact, many of their interactions were just peaceful trading relationships. Raiding was often simply what happened when negotiations failed or, trading with violence when the other guy was too weak to say no. The line between merchant and raider was incredibly blurry.
Let's zoom in on that second motivation for a second, because it is absolutely vital to understanding their entire economy. A thrall was an enslaved person in Norse society. Human trafficking was a fundamental engine of the Viking Age. Taking captives wasn't just some byproduct of war, it was a primary objective. Thralls were highly valuable, both to do the heavy labor back on Scandinavian farms and as high-value commodities to be traded across Europe, extending all the way into the Islamic world. Stealing human beings was just as crucial to their raids as stealing monastery silver.
Section 2. The truth in the dirt. What archaeology reveals.
When we shift our focus to what we've actually dug out of the ground, the physical evidence tells an incredible story. Take the artifacts found in Jorvik, which is modern-day Viking York in England. If the Norse were just mindless barbarians, you'd expect to only dig up swords and axes, right? Instead, archaeologists found highly sophisticated trade weights and scales. They found meticulous carpentry and spinning tools, which points to permanent, thriving craft communities. Amazingly, they even found cowrie shells that originated in the Red Sea. That proves Jorvik was a massive, cosmopolitan commercial hub, with trade connections stretching all the way from Scandinavia down to Byzantium and the Islamic world. The people who built Jorvik were urban traders and craftspeople, operating under complex, protective legal texts.
Okay, hold this massive number in your head for a second. 250,000. It is almost absurd to think about in a medieval context, but that is exactly how many pounds of pure silver the English paid out to the Vikings between 991 and 1012 AD.
We are talking about the Danegeld. This staggering payout was one of England's more pragmatic, if ultimately disastrous, responses to the invasions. English rulers, most notably King Ethelred the Unready, decided that rather than fighting these terrifying fleets, they would just pay them massive sums of extortion money to go away. They literally bought temporary peace. But, the dark, somewhat predictable humor of the whole situation is that the Vikings simply took the enormous chests of silver, went home, restocked, and came right back to ask for more.
The poet Rudyard Kipling absolutely nailed this flawed policy of appeasement centuries later. If once you have paid him the Danegeld, you never get rid of the Dane. It's a timeless lesson in the dangers of paying off extortionists. The English practically bankrupted themselves funding the very forces that were terrorizing them.
All of this builds a picture of an incredibly complicated medieval world. Take the paradox of the great Scottish monastery of Iona, for example. On one hand, we see the absolute horror. Iona was viciously raided by Vikings in 795, 802, 806, where 68 monks were slaughtered, and again in 825 AD. 4 devastating raids in a single generation. It was so bad the community eventually had to fracture just to escape. But here is the wild part. Generations later, Norse leaders, including actual Norwegian kings, were buried at Iona. The sacred site they repeatedly burned to the ground eventually became the holy resting place for the descendants of the raiders. Medieval history repeatedly refuses to be simple or fit into neat little boxes.
Section 3. The balanced verdict, savage or civilized. Honestly, asking if they were savage or civilized, that's kind of the wrong question entirely. The word Viking actually describes an action, a raid. It doesn't describe an entire people. The Norse were a whole civilization. Yes, the suffering they inflicted on places like Lindisfarne and Iona was horrific and real. We cannot and shouldn't minimize that. But human beings are extraordinarily complex. The exact same society that burned those churches also built the bustling urban center of Jorvik. They navigated the vast Atlantic and reached America 5 centuries before Columbus. They established legal systems to protect personal rights and crafted art of just breathtaking quality. They were both raiders and builders.
All right, Section 4. Let's test your Viking knowledge with 5 quick questions.
Let's see how well you've been tracking with the evidence here. Question number 1. Why are most written sources about Viking raids considered potentially biased? Think back to who was actually holding the pen. Take a second.
And the answer is because they were written by the monks and the victims. If you're writing a historical account right after your home was plundered, you have every reason to emphasize the horror, frame the attackers as godless pagan wolves, and, conveniently leave out their sophisticated trade networks. Moving on to question 2. Can you name 3 of the 5 motivations for Viking raiding that we covered? Remember, it wasn't just about mindless violence. They had distinct operating goals.
How'd you do? Did you get at least 3? The 5 motivations were wealth from the monasteries, slaves for the economic engine, land for long-term settlement, reputation for social status, and trade, because raiding was frequently just commercial expansion by force.
Okay, question 3. What does the physical archaeology in the city of Jorvik, or Viking York, reveal that completely contradicts the mindless barbarian image? What did we actually dig out of the dirt?
The answer? They were incredibly sophisticated urban traders, finding trade weights, artisan tools, and especially those cowrie shells from the Red Sea proves their commercial connections spanned thousands of miles. They were cosmopolitan builders, not just destroyers. Question 4. Think back to Ethelred the Unready. What was the Danegeld, and why did it ultimately fail as a strategy?
The Danegeld was that massive payout of silver, over 250,000 pounds of it, used to buy off the raiders. And as Kipling reminded us, it failed spectacularly, because paying extortion money just guarantees the extortionist is going to come back for a second payday.
And finally, question 5. Bringing this whole explainer together, what is the true balanced verdict on whether the Vikings were brutal savages?
The balanced verdict is that they were absolutely both. The raids were brutally violent, for sure, but their art, trade, and exploration were undeniably brilliant and civilized. Medieval people, just like people today, were endlessly complex. Which leaves us with a final, kind of provocative thought to chew on. If history is perfectly willing to label an entire multifaceted civilization solely by its most violent moments, who is writing your history right now? Keep questioning those sources.